Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to showcase some of the capabilities of the AWS Prototyping SDK, or PDK for short. So what we're going to do is we're going to set ourselves up with a monorepo-based project. And the monorepo project that we're going to be using is called the NX monorepo, which lives within the PDK. And this allows us to do really cool things like hermetic builds, build caching, being able to have polyglot packages with dependencies on one another, and a bunch of other cool things of that nature. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and bootstrap our project. So we can run this npx progen command. And what this progen command does is it basically installs a project into the directory that we're currently in. So I'm in an empty directory at the moment called prototyping show. And it creates a bunch of files like a package.json file, a bunch of NX metadata files and things of that nature. And most importantly, it allows us a place to be able to define projects declaratively. So for those of you that are familiar with the CDK, it allows you to define constructs declaratively, like an S3 bucket, for example, and that synthesizes into CloudFormation. Well, similarly, Progen allows you to synthesize declarative constructs into projects themselves, which is a really nifty feature. And by doing that, it allows us to create things like inter-project dependencies and support those kind of polyglot builds that I mentioned earlier. So we'll let this finish installing, and then we'll just check back in a moment. Okay, so that's now installed successfully. So as you can see, we have a whole bunch of files that have been synthesized for us. The most important one that we're going to be looking at today is the .progenrc.ts file. So the progenrc.ts file is the way that you, is the place where you go ahead and define all of your project constructs, dependencies and things like that that we actually want to pull in and build as part of this. So what we're going to do today to showcase all of the different features of the PDK is we're going to set up some infrastructure, so a CI/CD pipeline which will allow us to automatically deploy particular infrastructure based on us pushing code into a Git repository. We want to create an API declaratively using OpenAPI, using one of the new constructs that we've developed. And then finally, we want to be able to have a website call the API using a Cognito role. And that should be it for today. So we'll get started. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set up our dependencies, because a lot of these constructs live in different packages. So the AWS Prototyping SDK package is where stable constructs live. And then we've split out experimental constructs with the @AWS Prototyping SDK prefix. So we'll go ahead and add these all in. And then once we add them all, we need to be able to tell Progen that we need to pull down these dependencies. And the way we do that is by running the npx progen command, which will synthesize these effectively into lines in the package.json file in the root directory. So if we go ahead and run that command now, and once we let that run, we'll have all the dependencies we need to be able to define our constructs. So we'll let that finish and we'll check back in a moment. Okay, so that's now finished. So what we're going to do now is we're going to define our OpenAPI Gateway construct. So we have the OpenAPI Gateway TS project here, and it takes in a few properties. So the name is the name of the OpenAPI Gateway package. Default release branch is a standard field that's required by Progen. It's actually not used in this context. Parent is how this particular subproject is rooted. So given we're using a monorepo, we always pass in a parent of the monorepo project. Out directory is where you'd like this sub package to be synthesized into. Client languages is a really cool one. So we support TypeScript, Java, and Python. So for this prototype, we're going to be building a TypeScript website. So we're going to generate a TypeScript client. And then documentation formats allows us to be able to generate documentation based on OpenAPI metadata. So for this particular prototype, we're going to do an HTML2 documentation format. Okay, next what we want to do is we want to set up our website. So we're going to be using Cloudscape to do this, and we've vendored out a Cloudscape React TS website project. So for those of you who don't know, Cloudscape is a new UX design system that was recently released by AWS. And it provides a whole bunch of really cool components that you can use in your projects, like tables and tabs and all those kinds of great things. So we'll be showcasing some of that today. And then we also need to set up some infrastructure as well to be able to deploy all this. So we're going to deploy a PDK Pipeline TS project. What this project does is it creates a base CI/CD pipeline for you using a combination of code commit, code build, code pipeline. And by default, it just comes with a single dev stage. So we'll be able to showcase that today. It takes in, again, standard kind of inputs. One in particular is the CDK version. This is the minimum version, so we're just going to set that to 2.1.0. And for the infrastructure, given that we're going to be deploying a bunch of particular constructs, we just need to make sure that we have dependencies on those within the infrastructure itself. So we're just going to go ahead and add those now. Okay, so we've now added all of our dependencies. We've added all of our base projects. So similar to what we did before, we're going to run npx progen, and what's going to happen is this is going to synthesize 3 independent projects as part of this structure. So we'll check back in once that's done, and we can explore a little bit further. All right, so that's now completed. So if we take a look at the project, we should see a bunch of new files that were added. If we just go ahead and refresh this. Okay, so that's now completed. So we should have a bunch of new files in here and new packages. So as you can see in the packages folder, we have an API, an infra, and a website folder, which contain, if we just open up, the website, for example, and the source code, we have a bunch of pre-generated React code for us, similarly for the infrastructure and the API as well. So right now, each of these packages are independent and they don't have any dependencies. So what we want to do is we want to set up some dependencies between them, so that way the builds happen in the correct order. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a dependency between the website and the API generated client. And the reason we need that is because we want to be able to make API calls from the website using the type-safe client. The next dependencies we need to set up are between the PDK pipeline and the API itself. And then we also need to set up a dependency between the pipeline package and the website. The reason we need that is because the website will contain all of the built assets and things like that that we'll need to deploy to CloudFront. So similarly to what we did before, we're going to run npx progen, and this is going to set up all the dependencies between the particular projects. We'll check back in a few moments once that's done. Okay, so now that's finished. So what we want to do now is we want to just make sure that all of our dependencies are set up correctly. And the easiest way to do that is by using the npx nx graph command. What this is going to do, it's going to show us a website which we can visualize our dependencies. So as you can see here, this dependency structure looks correct to me. So what we want to do now is we just want to make sure that our project builds correctly. So we want to run a build command. So what we're going to do is we're going to run the nx run many command, and we're going to specify a target as build, and we're going to also pass in the all parameter. What this does is it looks through your complete package and packages and dependencies within your project. It builds them in dependency order. So as you can see, the generated client built successfully first, the API and the website are being built in parallel, and then finally the infrastructure will get built last. The really nifty thing about this is if I make a change, for example, to my infrastructure project, which is at the top of the dependency structure, I don't have to build anything below it because we can just use cache results for those. So it actually does save quite a lot of time in builds and things of that nature. So we'll let that finish and we'll check back in a moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Jack Stevenson, who's going to take you through the setup of the infrastructure and hooking up the website to the APIs. So Jack, take it away.
All right, so we'll drop into the infrastructure and have a look at the application stack. So this is kind of the entry point that gets set up by the PDK pipeline for you to define your infrastructure resources. So we're going to start with a sample API, and this is actually something that comes from the OpenAPI Gateway project. We get set up with a sample API construct. So let's actually have a quick look at that in more detail. So the OpenAPI Gateway project gives you a source folder with a spec.yaml file. So this spec.yaml file enables you to declaratively create your API operations and define types for inputs and outputs, all using the OpenAPI specification. What's really neat is it then generates a construct which can deploy all of these operations as resources and methods in API Gateway. So that is defined as a construct which is exposed here. We also get a sample API construct to get us started. And here we can specify how we would like to do auth for our API. So we actually support a few different types of authorizer. So there's IAM for signature version 4 auth. There's Cognito for using a Cognito user pool, or custom if you want to use a Lambda, or none if you don't want to secure your API. We also need to specify integrations for our API. And what's quite neat is we need to define an integration for each operation that we have defined in our spec. And so the type for this is generated as well. So if we omit the say hello integration, we actually get a type error saying that we're missing an integration for that operation. Each integration has a Lambda function that can service that request, and also optionally you can specify an authorizer if you want a different kind of method of authorization for a particular API method. Also, we generate TypeScript client, as we saw in the Progen RC. So this TypeScript client enables us to use kind of strong typing for any clients that want to call our API. As well as this, we actually generate types for use server-side. So we have a Lambda function here, which is going to use this as the source code. And it's using a say hello handler, which is exported from our generated API. And what this does is it gives us a type-safe interface to implement for that API. And behind the scenes, it handles all of the marshalling and demarshalling of requests, which means that if you, for example, don't return a required property, we actually get a type error here saying that we're missing the message in the body. Likewise, the input is all typed as well, so we can see we have request parameters and a body. The body doesn't have any properties. Request parameters, in this case, has a name. Okay, so that's the sample API. So we'll go back to our CDK application. So we've created the API. We're going to create a user identity. And this sets up all of the Cognito resources, so the user pool and identity pool for us to enable authentication for our users. Next, we're going to grant access to our authenticated users to call our API. Okay, so we've added our permissions now, and the final piece of our infrastructure is going to be the static website. So we're pointing the static website construct to the build directory for our Cloudscape website project. And finally, we're going to set up some runtime options as well. And what this does is allows us to pass parameters from our infrastructure down to the website, so we can point at the correct API URL. Okay, and we're done, so we can build this and then deploy it. Okay, so now that it's built, we'll deploy the pipeline. Okay, so our pipeline has deployed, and now we can mount our Git repository to the code commit repo and push. So we've got to make sure that we're back in the root of our mono repo, and we can git init. So we'll mount to the mono repo and we'll push that too. So we've pushed our initial commit of the repo to the pipeline, and while that's running, we'll update the website as we want to be able to show the result of an API call in our UI. So we'll head over to the website, and what's quite cool about this website is we have auth set up for us. So we already have code which is going to set up a login page and allow users to log in using our Cognito user pool. So all we need to do is add in an API client that we can use and then call that API to show the result. So we're going to create a hook for that. And what this is going to do is use the runtime context from the application. So all of this, we're going to need the API URL from that. And we're then going to create an API client from our generated TypeScript client. So the website provides runtime config context, which actually pulls down the JSON file with all of those properties from the infrastructure, which we can make use of here. We need the API URL. And let's create our client. So this imports from our generated TypeScript client, and it takes a bit of configuration. So it first needs the URL, and this needs to not end with a trailing slash, so we'll just check for that now. We also need to pass the fetch API to use. So in this case, we'll use the browser's default fetch. And finally, we need to be able to authenticate our requests. In this case, we used IAMAuth, so that requires requests to be signed using SigVie4 with some AWS credentials. And we'll use the AWS credentials of the currently logged in user. And we can do all of that with some middleware that we get given as part of the default website. So we'll add that in too. Okay, so we've got our hook. Now we can go over to the home page and we can make use of our hook if we export it. So we're going to set up some state to store the text that we get back from the API. And we're going to call our API on first kind of page load. So you'll see here that the client has types, so we have a say hello operation. And this takes a name. And then with the result, we'll just display that. Display the message that comes back, and then any errors we'll just log. Next, we need to display it. So we'll get a nice blank canvas, and here, if we have text, we'll display it in a header. And if it hasn't loaded yet, we'll show a spinner. Great, and we'll build all of this.
Hey Jack, just before you do that, I noticed that there was a typo on the runtime config. It should say web client ID, not website.
Good catch. Let me fix that. Okay, we'll build again. And we'll push that to the pipeline and let it deploy. Okay, so we've pushed that, and we can take a look at the pipeline to watch it deploy. So we should have our deployed pipeline here. So this pipeline, you can see that we have our source that begins with the monorepo. We then have a build stage, which runs the same command that we've been running locally. We have an update pipeline stage, so that's if you make any changes to the CDK, which defines the pipeline itself. That will actually self-mutate. We have an asset stage for uploading any assets, such as our static website. And finally, we have the application stage that we've defined, which deploys using CloudFormation. Okay, so our pipeline has successfully deployed everything. So next we can create a user in our user pool in order to log into the website. Okay, so now we'll look at CloudFront, which is serving our website. We'll see we've got our My Application website domain name here. And now we have our login page, so we're going to log in as our user with our password. We'll change the password. And we get an SMS code as well. And we'll log in, and we called our API successfully.